So I'm going to apologize to everybody. For some reason, my nice, nifty noise-canceling headset decided to stop working. And so you're going to be listening to me over my computer speakers, so apologies for that. And thanks for the intro, Alan. By the way, we did sound check before. It worked totally fine.
Yeah, well, that's why they let the horses run the race, Rich. No
Yeah.
big deal. All right, man, it's
Uh,
yours.
Yep. So anyway, thanks for joining us today. And I kind of like to describe this as one of those kinds of presentations I would never have gotten away with back in my Gartner days. But that was a long time ago, and I've actually relearned technology since I stopped working there. The impetus for this presentation is so day to day, kind of I spend a bunch of time working with different clients out there, helping them with almost exclusively these days with cloud security issues. And there's a lot of lack of information or misinformation and lack of understanding around cloud security. It's a massive topic, but one area that I get a ton of questions about, and it's also one of those areas that's kind of straightforward. It's easy for me. I don't have to get deep technical in terms of doing all sorts of weird programming and everything else to kind of make it work, is cloud security monitoring. It's a very practical issue. It's one that anybody who's dealing with cloud security at any level, any scale, needs to deal with, from small startups all the way up to the largest enterprises. And so the goal today is to go ahead and walk everybody through what's different about cloud security monitoring, and then we're going to focus in on those areas. We're going to talk about how do you secure the management plane. I'll talk in generic terms, and then I'm going to tell you some of the specifics on the different platforms, and then get into the basically how do you actually monitor your assets up into the cloud. We'll talk again some generic architectures, and then we'll dig down into Amazon. Now, I am warning you right now, I'm going to spend a bunch of time on Amazon because they have the greatest depth in terms of monitoring capabilities today, as well as it's just kind of, I think they still are like 85% of the cloud market, and it's a 1-hour session. There's only so much I can cover. It's also where I tend to do most of my hands-on work, so I can show you guys a little bit more hands-on as opposed to some of the other platforms. So I will talk about all of the platforms and the major platforms, but in terms of the level of detail, you're definitely going to get a lot more out of Amazon today. Now, don't worry, there's more generic stuff kind of in the front end of this presentation. We're kind of front-end loaded from that standpoint, but we've got most of the technical demos come in on the last half of it. So it's not just going to be architectural diagrams. I'll actually show you what this stuff looks like. Well, let's start with what's different about cloud monitoring. And I find that there's really kind of three major differences compared to security monitoring in a normal environment, in a traditional network environment. The first is we have the cloud management plane itself. Now this is really fascinating because the cloud management plane is something that we ourselves, it's very difficult or impossible to instrument. And that's also where you can completely control your infrastructure. So you log into the web consoles, you can build new networks, create stuff, destroy stuff, change settings, open firewall rules, whatever you want. That's all handled in the management plane. And yet we're very reliant on the capabilities the cloud provider gives us to deal with those changes. So it's a whole kind of a new area of monitoring. In our data center, we don't always get to that standard because we don't have this massive ability to monitor, where we have to, we kind of keep track of who walks in and maybe track individual logins on systems and those kinds of things. With cloud computing, we actually have a central capability that we've never had before. So it's a really interesting area to spend a very big chunk of time on the management plane itself. Now the next is the velocity, the rates of change. This is one of the things that it really inhibits, is kind of one of the more difficult challenges that people face, where, just to give you an example, Amazon, if you launch an instance, a virtual machine in Amazon, you get billed for an hour. If you kill it after 59 minutes, you get billed for 1 hour. If you kill it at 61 minutes, you get billed for 2 hours. Google bills on like 10-minute increments. And they do that because they realize there are people that have instances that survive for less than an hour. I mean, I'm one of them. When I'm doing my research work, especially, I'll have instances that, I've got them up and running for a few minutes and I shut them down. And those instances appear and disappear, and they may share IP addresses. They're going to be, there's not necessarily the ability to connect to them to pull logs out. There's all sorts of challenges because of how quickly the environment changes. And then the last piece is the distribution segregation. And what I mean is that within cloud, you might have 5, 10, 50 virtual networks all sharing the same IP address range, all with different things running inside them. That's just not that uncommon. There's people with hundreds or thousands of different cloud accounts, or if it's not accounts, which is the unit of segregation within Amazon, there's different projects, different ways of segregating out your environments across all of the cloud providers. And because of that, that also challenges our logging and monitoring because from a security perspective, we have to link into all of those things. And how do we actually get the logs to where we need those logs to be? So let's start with the management plane security monitoring. By the way, please go ahead and send questions as we're going along. So I'm a big fan of, and Alan will go ahead and interrupt as those questions come in. I'm definitely a big fan of people doing the Q&A, throughout the process of the webinar instead of just keeping everything to the end. So the management plane, as we talked about it, if you're on this, you probably know what it is. It's where basically you manage everything for your cloud. And there's two different techniques, and this is, depends on the cloud provider what your abilities are. The first is direct, and that's where the cloud itself will track that activity for you and then either store it on-premise or give you a way to pull it off-premise so you can do your own external analysis on it. The alternative is a proxy method where you have to intersect yourself between you and the cloud. Now, the direct method obviously has a lot of advantages because no matter how somebody connects from the data center, from their individual computer, from a smartphone, whatever it might be, you're going to be able to collect that activity if they have the metering in place. They should, but they don't always. Actually, very few cloud providers have comprehensive management plane monitoring where it is user accessible to you, the customer. That's because it's actually a very difficult problem to do that. On the other side, we have, okay, well, if we don't get all the capabilities we want, let's do a proxy. And there's tools off the shelf that can handle pieces of that. So, for example, Netflix Asgard is their deployment tool, but a big part of it was they were allowing that was how developers could connect to this open source tool, or open source now, of course it was closed source and Netflix created it, and then that's how they would submit to make changes to their environment, and all of that would be logged at that proxy. And then they would pull and manage those logs themselves. This is, if you use any of those CASB tools, I'm not going to talk about CASB today, this is really infrastructure as a service monitoring for the most part, but all the CASB tools, some of them can directly meter the cloud provider if the cloud provider has the monitoring capabilities and pull that data out. Others, you have to insert it in proxy mode because there's tons of particularly SaaS providers that have nothing in terms of any reasonable monitoring and logging that you can pull. So you have to do it in line with that. Now there's obviously the problem with that is if you're trying to monitor using a proxy and it's a cloud service and you don't control all the connections to that cloud service, your users can go around it. So there's some ways to deal with that. One is don't give them direct access to the cloud platform, so you need to keep your monitoring that way. The other is use DNS redirection if you can so that your account's tied to DNS. I use Box.com, and those guys, I have securosis.box.com is how we actually connect. And if you try to go to Box.com and log into Securosis, it redirects you to that DNS, so we could actually potentially manage things through DNS redirection techniques, which is the two that we've seen. But it definitely is not as effective as if you actually have the native monitoring built into the cloud that you can go ahead and leverage and pull that directly from the cloud provider. So what we find is that there's...
Rich?
Yes?
Rich, it's Aaron. Just real quick, did you give the proxy tool name out so people...
yeah, so one is Asgard, as in the, where Thor lives. They're actually depreciating that. It's not dedicated just for proxying and pulling logs. What it is used for is actually it's a deployment tool, but instead of having developers deploy directly onto the cloud platform, they just get access to that. There's a replacement tool that they're migrating towards called Spinnaker. And Spinnaker is much more DevOps oriented than Asgard has been. Spinnaker is kind of like the new version. It's also more cloud agnostic than Asgard. So Spinnaker, I think they currently have support built in for both Amazon and Google Compute or Google Cloud Platform. So those are the two tools. So it's Asgard and Spinnaker are two examples, both from Netflix. There's commercial tools like Exedium can do a little bit of this, which is actually a dedicated privileged user management tool. We've seen a lot of people build not a lot of people, they used to build their own. And the reason I say they used to is now we have better native monitoring capabilities. So they used to build their own, for example, for Amazon. I've seen, or use junk boxes and those kinds of things and pull the logs from there. Now, the cloud providers themselves have actually dramatically improved their support. But before I go into the details, Jules, we can go ahead and push that first poll question.
Let's do that. Jules, if you can get the poll up. There we are. And the question is, do you actively monitor the management plane API activity of? Select one of the following. And there are your choices. And Rich, we usually give people, I don't know, no more than another 5 seconds to get the vote out. So guys, if you can make your selection, we'll close voting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Survey says, Jules. There you go, Rich. What do you think?
I think I have to escape out of my slides to see the results myself. So.
Oh, okay. Let me read them to you. So the biggest one was none of the above with 39%.
Wow.
Followed very closely by AWS with 37%. Azure, 16%. Other, 11. GCP, 0. Is that in line with what you would think, Rich?
Yeah, that's pretty average. And actually, that's pretty, not even average, it's actually pretty decent because, you know, it's not a majority of people. It's not like 80% of people aren't doing any monitoring at all. So let me take a few minutes and let's go actually across what the cloud providers support. Now, there's a reason I only have these 3 up here. And again, I'm going to, you know, restate it. If you need to monitor like software as a service or you probably want to look at one of those CASB tools, the Cloud Access and Security Brokers. That's a whole different kind of topic, and I'll go ahead and you know, we can maybe do, if there's demand, just let us know. We can do a presentation on those later. So I've certainly spent a bunch of time talking about those things. In terms of cloud providers, the vast majority of people are on Amazon, Azure, and growing very quickly is Google, Google's cloud platform. I know there's other ones out there. They don't have a fraction of, you know, they only have a fraction of the market share of these guys, and we kind of have to focus on the major ones, and this is where we get most of the questions. So enough justifying why I'm ignoring, you know, the providers that some of you probably might care about. Let's talk about what the differences are. The first is Amazon. They have by far, they were the first to offer this, and then they have by far the deepest capabilities. They can log almost every API call that actually goes in. So that's using the tool called CloudTrail. I'll show you guys what that looks like and how to set that up. That's really powerful. It works across almost every region. It might have every region now, and across almost every service. And you know, definitely have gotten the vast majority of that in terms of their coverage that they've been doing over the years. And it's not just the API calls that you make into Amazon. It actually logs the API calls Amazon makes to your assets within the cloud, which is even more powerful. So I will sometimes get alerts with some of my monitoring for things that Amazon's automated tools are doing on the back end, as opposed to just when, you know, I try and log in myself and make changes and screw things up. They also have a configuration state over time tool, which is config. It doesn't watch everything, far less coverage than CloudTrail. But what that is for key things, particularly in Amazon EC2. It will actually track, for example, if you change a firewall setting, so a security group, it will tell you what was affected at that time of change. You can track those changes over time. So it's more of a configuration management tool that is complementary to CloudTrail. If you think about it, if you get a raw API call that, you know, change XYZ, figuring out exactly what that means in context a year later, a month later, can be very difficult. So that's what config is for. They also have system logging tools, which is CloudWatch, high-level security analysis, which their trusted advisor will actually look automatically for security issues for you. And they have a vulnerability assessment tool that's, you know, it's pretty lightweight, it's very new, just came out last November, but that's called Inspector. And I'll show you what a bunch of that stuff looks like. Microsoft Azure is a little different. So you get system generic sources, you can push anything into their log analytics service. And so that log analytics tool can take almost any kind of a log that you can throw at it internally. So that's your system log, excuse me, for example. They also have the ability to do security-specific monitoring and alerting for incidents, and that's the Azure Security Center. That actually leverages a lot of Microsoft's history in terms of having security tools and doing malware analysis and even IDS kinds of things. So they put those analytical tools and made those accessible to you as a customer when you're running in Azure. So you feed everything in, you subscribe to the Azure Security Center, and it'll pop off alerts and try and they advertise this using their big data techniques, machine learning, like everybody else on the face of the planet, and none of it probably works, but Microsoft definitely has a lot of experience in that area and security operations. And then last is they do give you direct activity and API collection in the console. The problem is I couldn't find documentation of exactly how deep that coverage was. So it doesn't look like it's to the depth of CloudTrail. You can actually export the data, and but when I've tested that on my own Azure accounts, it's reasonably comprehensive in terms of tracking all the activity through the console. And last is Google. So Google's really interesting because they acquired a company called Stackdriver, or a tool called Stackdriver for central logging, and they fully integrated that into GCP. And so they get some APIs. They don't have everything, so they actually list the services that I have on the slide here in terms of what at an API level is logged, and you can actually push all of that to Stackdriver, but Stackdriver itself can also take logs from just about anything else. And they also have some continuous, they have a security scanner as well. So you see across all of the platforms, you can collect that console management plane activity. Across all of the platforms, there's a place where you can push individual instance virtual machine logs and other arbitrary like application logs. And across all the consoles, they have some level of security analysis. But there's a lot of variation. So right now, to sum it up, Amazon's got the most in-depth in terms of monitoring. Microsoft and Google are pushing on that. They also probably have more depth in terms of their security analytics tools than Amazon has built in themselves, because Trusted Advisor just looks for common configuration errors. So with that, let's go ahead and push the second poll question, Jules and Alan, please. All right. Alan, you there? Jules, you there?
The question is, do you need to push the following to an on-premise SIEM? Select one of the following.
All logs, security relevant data, or none of the above. So let's see what people are pushing to their SIMs, and we'll close voting off here in just another, I don't know, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Voting closed. The survey says, oh, wow, this close. Rich, all logs 43%, just security relevant data 43%, none of the above 14%.
All right, well that's pretty interesting, especially as we start moving into the needs of managing volume of logs. So I'm going to start with the cloud management plane pieces and then how that gets pushed out into SIEM. And then we're going to talk about the individual kind of like system instance logs. What I found is that in working with organizations, or just talking with people who do this, organizations of various sizes, is that most people are looking at adopting cascading architectures to push the logs and eventually feed down what they need to their SIEM, which could be in the data center or in the cloud. And the reason is because the volume of logs can be so high, and in cloud there is a cost. The more copies of something you have to store, the greater it costs. The more network activity you have, the greater it costs. So here's an example of what this looks like. So the unit of kind of segregation within Amazon is an account. Within the other cloud providers, there's different ways of building your hierarchies for your projects. So let's imagine that for a given project, you have dev, test, and production. The cascading architecture concept is that you would take all of those and push the logs to a dedicated log account, or again, part of the project, a segregated part of the project. That would be where you would collect the logs. I'm going to show you how to do this actually within Amazon specifically. For that log account, that's all the logs. You don't keep multiple copies, you just push them all directly into that central logging, and that gives you the ability to keep your logs for your dev test production environments. What I typically recommend also is allow the local admins to have access to that, at least read access, not write access to those logs, because they're going to need that for debugging and everything else. This applies for both the management plane and for any other kind of logs. I'm going to show you the other kind of logs gets more complicated. We're going to cover that somewhere in about 5 slides or so. From there, you can take all of the logs for individual projects and push that to central security monitoring. Now here's where you have a choice. As we asked in the poll question, do you send everything or just the security sensitive ones? Depending on what you're doing, if you're keeping all of this up in the cloud, it can make sense to push everything into the security monitoring account at least once. But use techniques depending on your cloud provider so that you don't get billed for like internet data transfer rates just to keep that traffic down. That's one common way that we see that. Others will actually filter those down before those get put into the central security monitoring. The idea being that central security monitoring gathers everything is that's where you do more of your security analytics around that. Now from there, you send things to the SIEM, and this is almost always where you don't want to send the raw logs. You want to go ahead and send just the security alerts, because once you pop out of those boxes that are the cloud providers, that's where you start having to pay internet data rates, and so that can, has that potential to dramatically increase your costs. And for the management plane, which is where we kind of focus first, but as well for all of your system logs, this sort of a cascading architecture is almost always going to be kind of your best option to manage storage, meet your security requirements, as well as be able to keep your costs down in the cloud, because that's one of the things we have to worry about. So anytime you're transferring over the internet, you want to filter down. Now, management plane logs do have less data typically, unless you're doing ridiculous amounts of operations. So it may be okay to send those across the internet. You need to do a little analysis first. So be smart about this. There's not any kind of one answer about it. And I'll talk about how to do the filtering in a moment. You also need to make sure that you're getting all the data you're supposed to be getting. You want to make sure that you have a way to compare what you're paying for in the cloud. So how many, across multiple accounts, or within larger providers across all those multiple projects, and make sure you're getting all of that management plane activity sent into your central monitoring. One way to do this, for example, is I'm actually working on coding up like a little tool for myself to I can register all of my Amazon accounts by account numbers, and I can actually connect to those accounts and just make sure, or connect to my central logging, and just make sure those account IDs show up. And if the account IDs show up, I know I've got that right monitoring in place. And again, as I mentioned before, let project logs be readable by the project admins within the project storage. Don't let them write them, don't let them change them. But this is the nice thing about dealing with this replication, this cascading, is you still have them, allow them to have access to their logs, and trust me, I code stuff up on cloud providers. If I don't have access to those logs, it's a real pain. But you can do so without sacrificing security. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in Amazon. As I mentioned before, the different tools, CloudWatch, CloudTrail, CloudWatch, and Config are the 3 primary monitoring tools that we've got for Amazon. On the CloudTrail side, we've got, as I mentioned earlier, all the API calls. It actually stores it in Amazon's S3, which is its object storage service. But it can also simultaneously push those logs to CloudWatch, which I'll get into in a moment, which is the native logging service. Now, there's some timing things you need to know. The logs are written every 5 minutes, but there can be up to a 15-minute delay. And so I've seen anywhere, sometimes I'll get, like I have some alerts built off of this. I'll get them in 7 minutes, other times it's 15, other times it's closer to 30 minutes. It's in the JSON format. If you're doing anything cloud, you should be used to reading that at this point. You can also integrate with Simple Notification Service, so it can actually send a notification out when logs get written. So if you want to collect the logs with your SIEM, a lot of the SIEM providers who are cloud friendly actually have the ability to when they get that SNS message, it actually includes the URL of where the logs are, and it'll pull those logs in. And there's 7 days worth that they made visible in the console last year. Now, CloudWatch is there. It's just a performance monitoring and generic logging service, but you can obviously use that to pull your syslogs across. You can push CloudTrail logs to it to get kind of more immediacy, and to there's some more interesting things you can do there, because alerting and filtering is built into CloudWatch. And think about it, CloudWatch is the tool that Amazon has to use to figure out if like an instance dies to restart an instance in a security in an autoscale group. And so because of that, there's all sorts of like alerting and thresholds, and you can use it to set billing alerts and those kinds of things within there. So I'm going to show you actually how to use that, I think, on the next slide. And I'm going to switch over to my Amazon console and show you what that looks like to do that filtering and alerting. And then you can even push your application logs, pretty much anything. They even have an agent that you can run inside instances to push the syslog out to it. And then the last is config. And config's that special little beast that's more of a configuration management tool, but still has its own logs. It only covers some of the services. It's more about changes for really security sensitive stuff like security groups, identity and access management changes. And it'll be easier to show you what that looks like than anything else. Again, it, like CloudTrail, is a little bit slower, so it can take 15 minutes before something pops up or appears. And one of the cool things is before the end of the presentation today, I'm going to show you a method that works in about 10 seconds instead of 15 minutes, which is pretty cool and very new. It's only came out about, I think, 3 or 4 months ago. And all of these, by the way, have different rules and things that can apply to them. So let's show you what they look like. I'm going to pop over to my Amazon console here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just show you default CloudTrail. So this is the actual trails that we have. When you configure these, now these days it will default configure for all regions, or you can click a button, but they are different in each region, which is like different each geographical area. And you see this is where it goes in S3. You can actually encrypt your log files and validate your log files. I'll tell you when they've delivered, and you can publish to SNS, which means you can get those notifications, which is what you would use for automation. So you can pull the logs centrally based on those notifications. Now, one of the interesting things about this is this S3 log bucket, where you want to go ahead and save it, can be anywhere. So mine is in my account, but you can actually send these across accounts. So that, again, allows you to have that separate logging account and push logs. You have to set up all your permissions and everything correctly for that to work, but you can push them anywhere. Now, here's something that's really important if you set this up yourself, is you do want to push the CloudWatch logs, because that's going to give you the faster alerting capabilities that I'm about to talk about. Now, it does expose that data to anybody that has CloudWatch access, but I think the advantages are better than the disadvantages. And by default, you're going to get global services, which is things that are not region-based, like identity and access management. Now, what does this stuff look like? Well, if I actually pick, so this is what I was doing. I was doing some load balancer work this morning. And you can actually see that in the console, I can pull my date and time ranges, and it says what was the event. I registered an instance with a load balancer. The IDs, who did that, that was me, because you should never log in from your root account, but this is a test demo account, so I always log in from my root account on this one. Don't worry, I have multi-factor authentication set. But you can see everything, creating tags, all sorts of things. So I did terminated some instances, and again, that was for me. Let's see if I can get one from Amazon themselves here. Yeah, so here you'll see that a different user account, a configuration account, actually went ahead. So we've got that full tracing of that, and if I want to, I can view the event details, and it gives me all the JSON of the event. Now, this is great. It's only 7 days, but before they had it, it looked more like this. So here's my S3 bucket, here, where my logs are configured, and you'd have to dig down into your S3 buckets, into the region, into all the other areas, until eventually you get a listing of all those log files that are listed. And then you pull it up and it looks like this, which is just all of the raw JSON. So definitely not as much fun, and not, it's very programmer friendly because you can parse and do all sorts of stuff with JSON, but it's not necessarily very user friendly. So that's why it's great that they went ahead and added CloudTrail natively to the console. Now, CloudWatch, as I said, is the central dashboard for all monitoring. And you'll see there's a lot of things here like CPU utilization, other alarms and alerts that can be in there. But here's one, failed login. Well, what's this one? Well, if you look at it, I actually created a metrics filter here that I will have to show you in another part of the console where that is. And if anybody tries to fail login to the console, it's going to go ahead and send me an email to that. And where you would find that is in your metrics, in your metrics filters. And we'll modify the alarm. And there's the list of the different things or the metrics, sorry, where you set those up here. So the different filters come into, let me find this here, metrics. There we go. So if I go into one of my CloudTrail, I've got one filter set here. And this is an example of a filter where you can write basically similar to a regular expression. That filter can tie to an alarm, and in this case, it's looking for any identity and access management changes in my account. Now, it's a little bit complex because there's a bunch of different ways to build your alerting in across the services. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that alerting later. But if you want to actually look at the raw logs, you can come in here and let me pick one of my log streams, and then you get all of this very similar to what you saw in S3, but now it's native inside CloudWatch. We're going to pause on CloudWatch for a minute because I want to come back to it and show you with a little more depth to build the automated alerting that I just kind of breezed over. And then we have config. So this is AWS config. You see I have one rule in here, which is a rule is something that can be enforced. And so I have this rule that says my account is compliant because CloudWatch is enabled, or CloudTrail is enabled. If I turn that off, this periodic check would actually alert if that was turned off. I can also go ahead and look at individual resources. I'm going to switch regions to do this because my account is set up the way I've got this set up. I've had more historical monitoring on this particular region. But if I go ahead and I look at security groups, this is going to go ahead and list all of these security groups, and I can even look at a timetable of changes for this particular security group. And let me find one that's got some more changes on there. Oops, let me go back. Sorry, back button is a pain sometimes on these sorts of things. And I think it's probably this. You can actually go ahead and historically and see what all those changes are. And I apologize, I forgot the security group name. I'll do one last one here if I can't find it right away to show you what all the changes look like. That's the problem with doing live demos and trying to show like 5 to 6 things all at the same time. And when you pick a particular asset at a particular point in time, it'll actually show you the relationships and all the changes. So because I messed up my time scale on this, I'm just going to go ahead and move on back to the presentation. So those are the 3 main tools that we've got here. You have CloudTrail, which is all the detailed kind of activity API logging. CloudWatch, which is a generic place where you can dump all your logs, as well as though it gives you more of a real-time kind of view of what's going on within those logs. And then config, which is going to go ahead and give you those historical changes. Let me go ahead and change back to my region. That's fine, just because that'll mess up my other windows. And let's go back to the slides here. So hopefully it gives you a sense of what those look like. Now in terms of your initial configuration, as I mentioned, get CloudTrail running in all regions, send it to a secure S3 bucket with really tight writes on it. And if you're using that cascading multiple account architecture, push it someplace central. You do want to string those to CloudWatch. I'm going to show you why later. And you can add notifications to that to make sure that you can integrate with your SIEM. And then just turn on config. You can play with the config rules and stuff, but just turning on config itself will give you that change tracking over time. Now, server and application logs complicate this. So it can be tougher. Yeah.
Hey, I've been letting you run on here because, you know, we didn't stop the Germans when they bombed Pearl Harbor. But we have a few questions, if you don't mind. You want?
Yeah, go for it. Absolutely.
This might be a good segue. So first, just real quickly, can you speak to Power BI or Azure integrations for monitoring? And that might be a longer question than we can answer right here. If you want to hold that till later, that's fine.
Okay, go ahead and rephrase that one. Can I speak to Power
BI/Azure integrations for monitoring?
In terms of the specific tools, no, because I haven't checked. I'm not as up to date on the Azure specifics of pulling those logs out. So I know you can push logs into Azure's Log Analytics in terms of pulling them out, if that was what the question was. yeah, I'd have to do additional research on that one. It's just because most of the people we're doing our work with in terms of the hands-on stuff these days is on the Amazon side. I know Azure supports it. I don't know where the specific integration tools are.
Okay. Secondly, SIM does stand for Security Event and Security
Information and Management. Yep.
Yep. Next, Mike Shannon wants to know, can you comment on any personally identifiable information data that might be in the logs and moving that data to another place? Let's say
yeah, so that's a really interesting one. So it shouldn't, for the most part, be in the cloud management plane, the API calls, because that's not kind of directly where we're handling that PII, those kinds of regulated things. But a couple of things. One is you can encrypt it. And for example, in Amazon, you can encrypt it with a key that you control, with a KMS key, key management service key. Yeah, you can actually do that. In terms of server and application logs, as you'll see, you're totally responsible for building the logging infrastructure yourself. And so for your individual instance logs, for your app logs, it's your choice if you want to push that into a native log collector. But if you don't trust the native log collector, because technically, Amazon, Microsoft, Google can actually see your logs. They won't. I mean, that's a massive violation of their operating procedures. But if that's something that you're worried about, you can absolutely push that to you can build your own log collection infrastructure within the cloud provider, and I've got some slides showing what that looks like.
Great. Next, a tool we can use to monitor Kubernetes.
Well, Kubernetes is not specific to the cloud platform, so I need to go look and see how Kubernetes generates their logs. I mean, it's just like any server-based logging tool like that. You just push the logs to probably one of the generic log collectors. You can use Elk, Collectd, Stackdriver, I mean, almost whatever. So I need to take a look. Again, that's one where I haven't done that specific monitoring on it. But if you're running Kubernetes in the cloud, wherever you've got your cluster that's, where you're actually running your Kubernetes, you can take the logs from there. Now, there's a couple of pieces of that may make more sense after I get through the next few slides in terms of how you could actually push those natively in the cloud if you don't want to push it to the cloud monitoring service. Sometimes what we've done, it's actually what I just did for one of our internal things, was we built a kind of a file system replacement. So there's a lot of tools out there. We didn't build it from scratch, where we use an alias directory that pushes into a tool that pushes into Amazon S3, so we can natively keep those logs in S3 instead of having to kind of just generically store it on instances and the more expensive storage.
Okay, next. Which external tool do you recommend for cloud? Well, he wants to know, what did you rate Nagios as a cloud monitoring tool on a 1 to 5 scale?
Nagios isn't, I mean, we're talking about more log monitoring and security logs is my focus here. I know people have used Nagios and it's fine. Again, a lot of the SIM tools and Sumo and Splunk and all those guys support the cloud monitoring. Nagios is more of like system level monitoring stuff. That is a more philosophical than anything else. I've talked with people using Nagios, Dynatrace, with all sorts of different tools that are out there. I can't give you a 1 to 5 unless I've hands-on done it myself. And I hate to keep going back to that, but I don't like to give kind of a specific answer if I don't have that level of detail. What I can say is I don't see it used commonly in cloud for the things that are deployed up in the cloud. You can support it. I actually found a presentation the other day of somebody who was using it, but in terms of the people that I directly worked with and most of the people I've talked with, they've tended not to. And again, as I get into some of these server and application logging architectures I'm about to show, you'll get a better sense of the architectures and where a tool like that might come into play. But I can't give you a 1 to 5 on it. Sorry. I know I'm disappointing everybody, Alan. This is horrible.
Well, you know what? The problem is, Rich, when we talk about cloud today, certainly Kubernetes and Docker and the whole container thing and, all of there's so much happening. It's such a internet condensed time frame. You can write something today and tomorrow, well, what are you doing about this latest thing?
Yep. Well, if I jump into these architectures, that'll probably actually help answer a bunch of those questions, even if I don't know the specific tool.
Sure. All right, let's jump in, and I think I cleared our backlog for now anyway.
All right. So, in terms of the server application logs, and this is where we're getting more into kind of some of these, like, all right, if I need to pull Kubernetes logs, if I need to pull Docker instance logs and Docker, whatever container management tool like Kubernetes or whatever else I'm pulling, there's all sorts of zillions of things you can deploy in the cloud, as Alan was mentioning, and how do I actually collect the logs from that? It can be a tougher problem. Things will have shorter lifespans that are running up there potentially. As well as, you've got some data volume issues that you're going to have to deal with, and resiliency. So let me give you a specific example. If you're running, something like Kubernetes and it's got its local log storage in its cluster, hopefully if you're running multiple or, as opposed to just one instance with it running on there, that becomes a storage management issue because it's the more expensive kind of storage associated with that instance. If the instance goes away, that those things are running on, you're going to lose those logs. And so that's what brings us to this next section, which is across all of these other things you can deploy into cloud, how do you actually do it yourself? Well, there's two options. One is you can use the built-in tools. So I showed you what CloudWatch looks like. You can use a connector. Azure's got its log analytics, and Google also has their Stackdriver support. And those are generic log. Basically, think of it as a platform as a service to collect logs. They will take logs from almost anything. Anything you can push, like syslogs or files or whatever to, in many cases, those kind of logs can be accepted by these tools as long as they're in one of, a number of relatively standard formats, and then you can do your analysis. The disadvantage of these can be maybe you can't get the segregation you want, maybe it doesn't have the capabilities you want, maybe you don't want your cloud provider to potentially see the logs, to go back to that issue, was Mike Shannon asked about in terms of like PII and such being in there. And that's where you just go ahead and you can build your own, or you can even subscribe to the platform as a service. So this is where you piece this stuff together and you build it like any other cloud application within the cloud itself. And I've seen a bunch of different approaches to these. I've seen people just push to Splunk where they deploy Splunk virtual machines. I've seen them push it to Splunk's cloud service. Loggly, syslog-ng, all of these are different pieces and components that we've seen. The Elk stack from the Elastic Ice is pretty popular. Again, you can use the, either the commercial or the open source versions of that. There's a couple of tricks to this if you're building this. One is, obviously, capacity planning is pretty big. Elasticity of the cloud can help you with that. Clearly, that's why we're using cloud in the first place, so that's good. The other is, you do want to push those logs into object storage as best you can. And here's what I mean by that. There's volume storage, which is the virtual hard drives associated with things like when you run virtual machines, instances in the cloud. Then there's object storage like Amazon S3 and Google and Microsoft both have their own versions of cloud storage, and that's called cloud storage, where that tends to be more durable because it's not trying to emulate a hard drive. It also tends to be much more cost efficient. Many of them, there's a lot of various kind of open source tools out there where you can map part of your file system to actually push externally into one of those. Or you can use a technique like we're going to be using for one of our things where we just have a script that runs that every 5 minutes we gzip files and then we push them off to an external route collector. There's a lot of ways to do it, but again, you want to try and push that out to that more durable storage. And depending, you can either manually encrypt those, or not worry about encryption, depending on what you're doing, or some of the cloud providers will support native encryption of that sometimes with keys that you can control. The cascading architectures do start to become really important here. Again, it's all about managing capacity. It's all around making sure that maybe you collect some stuff locally and then you push security alerts off into a different part of your environment, which would look something like this, where you can have your multiple accounts. It's dumping syslogs into S3 buckets. Those can all feed into that project log account, and that's where you have some processing running on. Like FluentD can do a lot of this. So FluentD can process those logs, filter, and then just send the escalated events someplace else, which is eventually what goes into your security operations center. And it's that cascading, that filtering, that escalation process that can help you most efficiently use cloud for your monitoring. And here's just some examples. So recently, the Center for Internet Security released their benchmarks for Amazon Web Services, and they suggest using metrics filters, which I'll show you what those are in a minute. I kind of showed you a little bit actually what those were already for unauthorized API calls and changing encryption key things and changing IAM policies. It was a nice list of activities at the cloud management plane kinds of things that you might want. And of course, you already should have a sense for within your servers and applications what level of things you wanted that are security sensitive on individual instances. The other thing too is if you do that filtering, you can keep those logs up where they are natively generated within the cloud, again, trying to use object storage. So if you need to go do a forensic investigation afterwards, you still can have access to those logs, but you're still not pushing tons of network traffic and having to deal with all the problems of setting up multiple SIM collectors for your SIM and all the complexity associated with that. Now in Amazon, as I mentioned specifically, you push from CloudTrail to CloudWatch, and there's no native alerting in CloudTrail. So all of the alerting happens over on the CloudWatch side. And within that, you can do metrics filters, which is what I tried to show you before, or events or rules. Now what's interesting is it turns out, and this isn't very well known, that there's a separate messaging bus within Amazon that they use for these CloudWatch events that's faster than waiting for CloudTrail to get the logs. So it's not like CloudTrail is writing the logs to Amazon S3 and then S3 is pushing them into CloudWatch. There's like a faster messaging system around there. And let's show you what that looks like. So if I go back into my CloudWatch tab here and I go into events, you can create rules. And rules are things that respond to particular events that occur within your environment. And by creating a rule, you can actually select the event source. So it can be some native things. These are the things that CloudWatch natively does, which is EC2 monitoring and auto-scaling. We're going to just do an API call, which all of a sudden opens up everything within Amazon to us. So let's do, I don't know, let's do an identity and access management one. Or I'll just do EC2 to make it faster, since I know where those are. So I can do like an EC2 and any operation, or I can specify a specific operation, and you can literally get down to almost every API call. So anytime somebody, okay, they attach a VPN gateway and they go ahead and, or create a new instance. I can go ahead and set those rules, and then I can add a target, which is where do I send that to? And it can be just a simple notification, or it can be a Lambda function. And I'm going to show you what that is in a minute. But here I can send it to a topic. I have my failed, or my CloudTrail topic that sends me emails of these things. And you can actually add multiple targets to this and have multiple notifications get kicked out. And then you do all sorts of details, but I'll cancel out of it now. So here's one I've got that you'll see in a minute, which is reverting a security group, where I have a particular event pattern, which is anytime there's an API call via CloudTrail that authorizes security group ingress, this trigger is going to alert, and it works really fast. Now the other side of it is config. So if I go into the config rules, and I add a rule here under config rules, let's just say that okay, is unrestricted SSH allowed? It's just one of these built-in rules. And I can go ahead and set it, in this case, it's anytime the configuration changes. You see that's automatically selected. It's not going to run periodically like that CloudTrail one. And then I figure out what the resources are that are associated with it. That's all set. And it'll go ahead and send that alert out because that's all built into the config side of it. So config is a little more limited and it's slower. And I'm going to do a demo of the Lambda function rules in a minute. Now the other part of CloudWatch is these metrics filters, and you can go in and set up your various metrics in here. So where do I have my problem? I don't use these anymore. So, but you can basically set metrics tied to all of your various assets within there. But you can also set up your alarms. And if you create an alarm, you pick it based on your metric. And so we have across all rules, for example, oops, that probably wasn't the right one to go ahead and put there. And EC2 metrics, and these are tied to specific instances, but you can also put generic metric filters in and apply them. That was the old way to do it. That's what the CIS benchmarks recommend, is using these metrics filters and then creating an alarm off of a metrics filter. but I just found that to be slower, so I no longer recommend that as the primary technique for monitoring, unless that's all that's available, because there might still be use cases where that's all that's available. So let me pop back over to the slides real quick to finish up in our last 5 minutes, because I've got one last demo to get to now that I've showed you what it looked like, which is I'm going to show you actually how to leverage all of this for real-time event-driven security. So in this case, I'm actually going to tie the notification to real-time kind of monitoring and alerting. It's going to tie a bunch of these pieces together. So I'm going to change the security group. When I change the security group, as we mentioned, that's an API call, so that's going to be recorded to CloudTrail. When CloudTrail records it, it's going to send it to that CloudWatch log stream that I showed you, which is where that you're streaming that more real-time log across, and it uses that faster process. From there, that's going to hit the trigger like we just showed. I'm going to actually show you what the trigger looks like. But in this case, that trigger is going to go to something known as a Lambda function, which I'll explain what that is in a minute. And that Lambda function is code that runs in Amazon. It only runs when it's triggered, so you don't have a running server someplace. It's literally sitting there, and Amazon runs them in Linux containers. It'll pop it up, it'll run it, and it will shut it down. And in this case, it's actually going to go ahead and in real time, in near real time, revert that security group. So in an average of 10 to 15 seconds, sometimes even a little bit faster, I'm using this native logging security monitoring infrastructure to not only collect the monitoring and logging information, but to actually revert a change based on a rule. And this is one of the more fun things. So let me go ahead and I'll show you what that looks like real quick in the configuration pieces of it. So the Lambda function I have is right over here, and it's called Fixed Security Group. And this is Python code, and it's running in a container that's up in Amazon. And what happens is when it's triggered, it receives a particular event, and it'll actually dump that back into CloudWatch logs. And then under various conditions, and in this case, it's only going to work if it's a particular security group, which is just a hard coding thing I have in there. It'll actually run the code, it'll pull the changes, and then it will go ahead and reverse those changes within there. So that's just a bunch of API calls and such that are running inside of basically using the SDK for Python. So if I go into my rules area and my revert security group, this is, as I showed you, it'll trigger anytime there's a security group ingress change, and it will trigger that particular Lambda function. So what does it look like? Well, here's the security group I've got. I'm going to edit it, and let's add a rule. Let's open up, I don't know, let's make it SSH to anywhere, something you most definitely would not want to do. Save it, and you can see it appears in the console there. If I actually go back to CloudWatch, go into my logs, and oops, I forgot to check which of the two versions. Yeah, revert security group is active. So I go into my logs, and I go to revert security group. You'll be able to see it when it triggers, and it looks like this. So this is the data that's actually stored within CloudWatch. So my full version, it says someone other than the test account tried to make this change. The designated security group, this is all different conditionals that I have in there. And then it goes ahead and it actually will revert it. So if I refresh this page, click on my thing again, and I'm still waiting for it to execute. So I thought I wasted enough time that it would have gone ahead and run. But sometimes for whatever reason it can take a little bit longer. And boom, there it is. Woo, I got nervous there. That one took almost 30 seconds. So as you can see, very quickly it went ahead and actually reversed it. So we actually have that ability to make this event-driven architectures, which is something that I find is just absolutely fascinating. We're leveraging the power of cloud to enable security capabilities to be very difficult for us to go ahead and actually do ourselves internally. The code's pretty simple. It's all available up on GitHub. So the GitHub Securos, this is called the Lambda example. It's very functional, and there's the README file there actually shows you how to run the entire thing. So that's it. Pretty much out of time today. So remember, there's multiple layers of monitoring, but the main ones are the cloud itself, the management plane, and then the assets you put into the cloud. You do want to really leverage those cascading architectures. You want to do a bunch of filtering and alerting because that can be very advanced, including real-time changing your environment if you want, or it can just be a technique to only get the security-sensitive things out to your security monitoring. Remember, all the platforms are very different. I showed a lot of Amazon. How Microsoft and Google run these, they actually have a lot of those same capabilities. They both have triggers, like I just showed you in that last example. They both have an equivalent to Lambda, like I used in that last example. Everybody's got their different ways of managing that, and the specifics really are very different. And so depending on what platforms you use, I do most of mine in Amazon, which is why I went ahead and did most of the demos there in Amazon. But it's up to you to make sure you understand the capabilities of that platform, that you can get the data you need, put it to where you need to. And remember, you can still always build your own log infrastructure up in the cloud and maintain it. Just try and be smart about the kinds of storage you use and how you push your logs around. So with that, if you want to see more of these kinds of things, come over to our Black Hat training that I'm running this year. We're actually running 2 different classes, or 3 if you count the same class 2 days in a row. And back over to Alan and Jules, since I had pushed the clock to the limit.
Perfect timing, Rich. We don't like to leave any extra minutes on the floor, so it's all good. As Rich's slide puts up there, he will be doing Securosis training at Black Hat USA for our security friends who are at Black Hat. Rich also usually does training is a frequent contributor at the RSA conference as well as at many security conferences, obviously, as well. So, Rich, thanks very much. We do have a minute. Does AWS provide any notification by default whenever Lambda functions get triggered?
No, but you can build that in. So it's I used it as a automatically reverting kind of a thing, but you can actually put a trigger in using SNS, the Simple Notification Service, to push that out. They don't do that by every time it runs, just because Lambda functions. I mean, a lot of people build completely serverless architectures and run like 1 million Lambda functions a day, and that would kind of eat up your phone pretty quick.
Got it. One last quick question. Does AWS, oh, we did that one. Is there a good open source repository to get Lambda code for event-driven security scenarios?
Not that I've seen. So I've published our code, which is a specific, this specific example that I used today. There's occasionally Amazon's AWS, they have their security blog. They've got a bunch up there on using Lambda for a couple of different scenarios, particularly with their Amazon WAF. There's a bunch of examples there, but there's very few people doing this work. So to be honest, out there in the world, and which is why I'm always looking for new examples myself. And I plan on publishing more, but that's the one that we've got up for now.
Great. Okay. Hey, Rich, we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much, my friend. I'll be in touch with you. Audience, you were great. I hope Rich answered your questions, opened your eyes to some things. Stay tuned for another DevOps webinar soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com.